Not too long before the making of this video, Zack Snyder came out with like the 100th statement on his DC movie, saying he wasn't surprised by Batman and Superman killing getting backlash, saying some people got brainwashed by material that's not consistent with true canon. Now this, alongside him saying a Batman that doesn't kill is irrelevant on Joe Rogan like a month prior, as well as at one point unironically basically quoting a Superman villain when he said that if you think heroes shouldn't kill, you're living in a dream world, reminded me how grateful I am that he no longer has creative control over DC, and it baffles me to no end that he ever did. This deconstructive mindset in regards to these characters, that they aren't fit for movies so you have to change them, or completely not understanding them at all, is something that just absolutely needs to be left in the past. This then got me thinking of what else the DCU should avoid, either to prevent the same failure the DCEU suffered, to fit with what we know about the universe at this point, or to simply set itself apart from every other live-action DC adaptation. So in this video, I'll be going over the biggest things the DCU needs to avoid in order to succeed, specifically by looking at other live-action DC universes to see what lessons could be taken from each one of them, in order to kind of mesh together all the best aspects of every live-action DC universe to build the ultimate live-action DC universe through the DCU. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe, help me get to 100,000 subscribers, and definitely let me know exactly what you think should be avoided in the comments. So let's start with the big one, the DCEU, and stay on the topic of Zack Snyder, from which the DCU should take the lesson that it should hire creatives who actually understand the characters and what makes them special, as opposed to only really being interested in deconstructing them. This, I think, was one of the biggest reasons the DCEU failed. The fact that the man spearheading the main projects of a live-action DC universe has never understood the DC universe or its characters. Zack Snyder has said before that he sees the DC universe as a mythology, as epic tales about gods among men. The DC universe can be seen in that way from an outside perspective, but reading almost any comic or watching almost any outside media that takes place in the DC universe tells a completely different story. The DC universe is a bit more removed from our real world than Marvel is, and that also manifests itself in its tone. The DC universe is more idealistic, a bit more colorful and full of characters with the powers of gods who are also just regular people. It doesn't make sense for Superman to act like an alien removed from humanity. He grew up on a farm in Kansas and always managed to kind of fit in with other people. It's not realistic for him to be hopeful and inspiring in a cruel world all the time, sure, but if anything, that's exactly what makes Superman special. As James Gunn said, he's kindness in a world that sees kindness as old-fashioned. That aspect of the character is something that the DCEU and every other attempted deconstruction of the character completely missed out on. Without that, he doesn't really bring much of anything interesting to the table. He's too perfect, he has all the powers. With it though, he's one of the greatest characters in fictional history who can even sometimes inspire real people to be better. A Batman who doesn't kill obviously wouldn't be very effective in the real world, but the DC universe is not the real world. Batman is a superhero. He fights superpowered threats on a regular basis as a regular man. There's a lot about Batman that wouldn't make sense in the real world. Him not killing is a core tenet of his character, without which some of his most popular villains and stories wouldn't make sense. It's the crux of his rivalry with the Joker and core characteristic of who he is. Batman and Superman and the rest of the DC universe are not in need of some deconstruction and big change to make them suitable for a live-action setting, beyond maybe the skin-tight suits. There's a reason these characters are popular, there's a reason these characters have had stories written about them for decades, almost a century at this point. Changing their core characteristics doesn't respect the history or the characters themselves. This deconstructive mindset, this insane misunderstanding of what makes the DC universe special, needs to be avoided at all costs in the DCU. Luckily, it seems like the DCU will be doing exactly that, and we'll be using the first movie, Superman, to show that off. It seems like everything about Superman will portray Clark, Lois, Metropolis, and the world of Superman with full earnestness and zero embarrassment towards the source material. Some other examples of poor characterization from the DCEU other than Superman, Batman, and Flash include Jonathan Kent, quirky Lex Luthor, weird Joker, unserious Aquaman in Aquaman 2, Shazam feeling more mature as a kid than he does as an adult, and Black Adam having no interaction with Shazam, which also speaks to a similar type of creative you shouldn't hire, someone like The Rock, someone who clearly only ever really cared about putting himself in the forefront of this universe, attempting to do so with absolutely no knowledge of how, considering he tried to make a DC universe around Black Adam of all characters, while refusing to allow Black Adam to even be seen with Shazam, his arch enemy, the character for which he exists to be a villain to. The Rock is someone who is governed clearly by a little bit of ego, if not a lot. He he is not allowed to lose fights in movies and it's in his contract. It's crazy, and someone like that should be kept away from any creative part of the DCU, and honestly, he's also not a good actor, so I would keep him away from the DCU just in general. So I do think that's probably the biggest thing that the DCU needs to avoid that the DCEU didn't. Creatives like The Rock and Zack Snyder, who just don't understand the DC universe and end up characterizing the characters they're adapting very poorly, and that leads to those characters just not really feeling like the same character as the comics, and certainly not having all the best qualities that the comic character has. In a very similar vein to how they approach the DC universe, I think the big lesson that the DCU needs to take away from the DCEU is that casting is extremely important, and that a dedicated casting director who understands the characters in the DC universe is extremely important as well. From Jared Leto to Jesse Eisenberg to Ella J. Bosco to Ezra Miller specifically, the DCEU had too many bad castings and too few fantastic ones, which contrasts strongly with the MCU, which is very nearly perfectly cast. The casting of these characters matter because the actors influence what the characters look like, the vibe they give off, and their mannerisms, all of which can make the character not feel like the same character as what they're trying to adapt. It's similar to how they approach the DC universe, in that it does change the core characteristics of the character and can make that character not feel like the same character. A good example of this, and I think this could be a bit controversial, is Henry Cavill, who definitely looks the part, but based on everything I've seen him in, including the DCU movies where he played Superman, he doesn't really have the right mannerisms to pull off Superman well. He would have, I think, been more fit to play Batman, considering he's pretty good at the broody, growly character like he plays in The Witcher, for instance, or honestly, his version of Superman feels a bit more like Batman than he does Superman. I think Henry Cavill definitely could have maybe potentially, if he was written well, become a good Superman, but I've seen poorly written Superman just feel more like Superman in the past, like the CW one played by Tyler Hoechlin. He just gave off the vibe that Henry Cavill, to me, never did. But much worse than that is Ezra Miller, who checks all the wrong boxes. Ezra Miller, who, by the way, was Zack Snyder's first choice to play the Flash because, of course, doesn't look like Barry Allen, doesn't feel like Barry Allen, doesn't act like Barry Allen, they don't even know how to run, and that doesn't even cover the real-world problems they caused. What you get out of that is a wholly different character, and at that point, you might as well just not be adapting them. As a huge Flash fan, at one point, the Flash was my favorite superhero. It never for a second felt like I was watching the Flash on screen. Instead, I was watching Ezra Miller kind of attempt to run, and that's not a fun experience. So far, every casting in the DCU seems to have been pretty spot on, with like one exception, and it does seem like, at least for now, James Gunn has overseen every casting in the DCU, which is definitely a good thing because from what I can tell, James Gunn loves the DC universe. Still, I think the DCU can use its own version of Sarah Haley Finn, who is the casting director of every MCU project, and has done an absolutely incredible job helping bring comic book characters right out of the page to the screen through their actors. James Gunn can potentially continue to have that role, but also I feel like James Gunn's plate is pretty full. He's writing movies and shows, directing movies and shows, he's also the Kevin Feige of the DCU, he put it all together. I feel like maybe they should hire someone, a dedicated casting director for the entire DCU, like in the vein of Sarah Haley Finn. The DCEU had a bit of an issue with its characters of only really being interested in their characters' most popular stories. The Dark Knight Returns inspired Batman and some of the story in BVS, which also adapted the death of Superman, and the Flash movie adapted the only Flash story that had already been adapted into a movie before. All of these stories have already been adapted into animation or even live action before, and at this point have all been done to death, as have other stories from outside of the DCU that just seem to take up a lot of the spotlight of the characters and teams outside media when there's so many other stories to choose from. Stories like Teen Titans The Judas Contract, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Justice League Throne of Atlantis, Batman The Long Halloween, Batman Under the Red Hood, and the origin stories of the likes of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Jon Stewart and Hal Jordan, Green Arrow, Robin, and Shazam. This surface level knowledge in regards to the DC universe and the stories that could be adapted needs to be left in the past. All these characters have decades upon decades of stories to pull from, some of which are, I think, better and have more potential than the most popular stories, and so it would definitely be a shame not to consider them and have such a small view on what is acceptable to adapt. There are stories that just have been adapted too many times. For For all the criticism the early MCU got for its villains, the DCEU had it way worse. Between Doomsday, Ares, Justice League, Steppenwolf, the Seven Deadly Sins, and even to a certain extent, Darkseid, the DCEU had a lot of villains who are big, gray, hulking, bad CGI villains who all blend together into being equally as forgettable as each other with some exceptions. Other villains like Incubus, Cheetah, and Sabbac have bad CGI and almost no substance. Then there are movies like Shazam! Fury of the Gods and The Flash, which didn't even try to utilize their rogues galleries. Shazam had access to Mr. Mind and should have had access to Black Adam, but created boring new villains instead, while The Flash, who genuinely has like one of the 5 best rogues galleries in comics, and yet the movie invented a new villain. All in all, the DCU had very few good memorable villains. The ones that were General Zod, Ocean Master, Dr. Savannah, Starro, and Black Manta, plus also White Dragon and the Butterflies from Peacemaker, the only show in the DCEU. And to give credit where credit is due, the Zack Snyder's Justice League version of Steppenwolf. Everyone else left a lot to be desired, and then it doesn't help that the best comic book villains of all time, like the Joker and Lex Luthor, were adapted so poorly. This is an issue that really needs to be avoided in the DCU, and it really doesn't need to be hard to do so, considering how great of a rogues gallery the DCU has. I would say that this is something that will probably be done well, as just looking at James Gunn's past comic projects, the villains only improved over time. Ronan was fine, but then Ego, Starro, White Dragon, the Butterflies, and the High Evolutionary were all different levels of fantastic. The DCEU had a lot of armor-based suits, which did work for Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and obviously has to work for Cyborg, but I do think that for everyone else, armor should not be used. Armor could work for Batman, but the Batman franchise is currently using an armor-based suit, and the DCU will need to differentiate itself from that. But even if it didn't, the material used, for instance, in the BVS suit, I think made for the best-looking, most comic-accurate live-action Batman ever put to screen, and so the DCU should take that material and try to adapt a Batman suit from another era. Aside from that, most other superheroes don't really look as much like superheroes or the characters they're adapting in armor, not to mention the toned-down colors. I mean, I enjoyed Zack Snyder's Justice League for what it was, but the colorless and uniformed look of the Justice League made for such a boring-looking team that would have benefited greatly from, say, Aquaman's orange, Superman's light blue, Martian Manhunter or Green Lantern's green, a brighter red for the Flash. You could see this in the Arrowverse, where the crossover showed off far more colorful team-ups that made that unofficial B-tier Justice League feel more like the Justice League than the DCEU's. There are obviously a lot more lessons that can be taken from the DCU, like don't rush projects, don't make movies without a good script or vision, but those are kind of obvious and true for every movie ever made. So what I mentioned up until this point was, I think, the big ones, but let's look at another side of the DCU, the TV shows, and see what lessons can be learned from the Arrowverse, which came together a bit more naturally than the DCU, and I'd say even reached a higher peak in terms of a relative success, but basically completely died off after Crisis on Infinite Earths and went out on a complete whimper, and also had projects that were way worse than anything in the DCEU. There are many positive lessons that the DCU could take away from the Arrowverse, such as the aforementioned coming together more naturally and slowly, as well as casting really well. The biggest thing I think is the great chemistry between the heroes. It was always so much fun to watch Oliver and Barry team up with each other, so much fun to watch the Trinity of the Arrowverse team up with each other. It felt like they kind of captured the Batman and Superman dynamic between Green Arrow and the Flash, and the Trinity dynamic between Green Arrow, the Flash, and Supergirl, more so than the DCEU ever did. If that same feeling is captured in the DCU, like the Superman and Batman dynamic or the Trinity dynamic, I do think we're in for something special that the DCEU never really got around to. As for what to avoid, I do think there is less to learn from the Arrowverse, not because it was perfect, it was far, far from it, but because most things that the Arrowverse tended to struggle with doesn't really much apply to the DCU. The small budgets, the restrictions of what they can and can't do, or what characters they can use, the overabundance of original characters because of it, the CW teen drama approach and the CW's target audience's influence over the shows, the overly long seasons, the short breaks between seasons that didn't really leave much room for writing well, and then also just in general some poor writing. The fact that the Arrowverse had all that holding it back and still did more than the DCU for the most part is honestly quite impressive, but considering most, if not all of that, doesn't really apply to the DCU, what lessons can be taken from the Arrowverse? Well, this will be a little bit more specific and maybe a bit more of a personal opinion-based thing, but I'd say the DCU versions of the main Arrowverse characters should be very different from their Arrowverse versions. For instance, Supergirl in the Arrowverse was basically just a female Superman, just as hopeful and inspiring, with little little to no edge, something that you'd think someone who watched her entire world die would have. This is already confirmed to be changed for the better in the DCU, as the Supergirl in Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow has already been described as a lot more jaded than Superman, and I cast someone who, based on their one portrayal that I've seen them in House of the Dragon, definitely can pull that off. But that should extend to Green Arrow and the Flash as well. Green Arrow should be far less Batman-esque, less serious, less broody, more trick arrows, and also they should definitely put more focus on the Green Arrow / Black Canary relationship, while the Flash, I think, should simply not be Barry Allen in the DCU. The reason I say this is because throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, I think basically everything that can be told about Barry Allen, whether that be in animation or live action, has already been told. And Wally West, who mind you was the main Flash for 30 years, and basically most popular Flash characteristics as well as the best Flash stories come from him, has been completely left by the wayside. And I think it's time, because of that this Barry Allen era that started around in 2007 when he came back to life in the comics should come to an end, and Wally West should be given back his spotlight. This is something that's been slowly happening in the comics again, and considering that Nightwing, his contemporary, is already an adult in the DCU, I think that Wally should be the primary Flash in the DCU. Maybe Barry could appear briefly, but I do think he should die. There are a lot of other characterizations from the Arrowverse that should be avoided, like absent Batman, Aquaman, and Wonder Woman exist only to make Supergirl look better Superman, quirky Mr. Terrific, lame Hawkman or Hawkgirl, a Martian Manhunter who is mostly in human form, inexperienced and poor fighter Black Canary, superhero Jimmy Olsen, billionaire Ray Palmer, and superhero Killer Frost. All of those I do think should be avoided in the DCU, but honestly, I don't think that should be a problem. In terms of costumes, the Arrowverse definitely struggled early on because of their budget. Their early leather costumes usually left a bit to be desired, but it seemed like the Arrowverse found a great balance between aesthetic and functionality within even their small budgets, with costumes like the Flash in later seasons, Batwoman, Black Lightning, and looking more comfortable, not restricting too much movement, and still looking like a superhero. If anything, the more expensive looking suits of most heroes kind of takes away from the character's look, makes them feel less authentic. Obviously, this isn't true for like someone like Batman, who's a billionaire, but someone like the Flash, I think, who had like the high budget looking armor suit in the DCEU, never looked as much like the Flash as the more simple, toned down, and very superhero costume looking suit of the later seasons of the Flash. The DCU can certainly take all of that into account. Technically a part of the Arrowverse's multiverse, Titans felt right at home in the DCEU with the edgier, darker, armored up, and poorly characterized versions of the titular team of heroes. DCU Nightwing cannot be that much of an asshole or bad leader, nor should he wear such heavy armor considering how much mobility he needs. Beast Boy should always be green, Starfire should feel a lot more alien, Cyborg should be a part of the team. Titan's Batman was even worse than the DCEU portrayal, looking more like Alfred than Batman and being portrayed as an abusive father. The Bat family should not be shown in that light at all in the DCU. Just to be positive though, there are some costumes like Hawk, Dove, Aqualad, and Wonder Girl from Titans that look pretty much perfect, and whatever they did there I do think can be brought over into the DCU. They could use some of that because they kind of perfected a lot of live action costumes on Titans. The Doom Patrol TV show could be a great case study for how the DCU should approach the weirder side of the DC universe, while Stargirl could be a great case study for how to approach the JSA side of the DC universe as well. The characteristic that I mentioned previously of the DCU having both movies and TV shows is something that even the MCU has struggled with since the Disney Plus shows have started, and so if the DCU is to succeed in that endeavor, it needs to take some lessons from the multiverse saga of the MCU. TV shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Hawkeye, Moon Knight, Miss Marvel, Secret Invasion, and Echo all told stories that either would have been just as fitting or even would have fit better as a movie rather than a show. This isn't helped by the extremely short 6-episode seasons that aren't actually much longer than the runtime of a long movie, making these shows feel like movies with a lot of unnecessary padding. This is something the DCU should very much avoid. TV shows have an advantage over movies in that they do have more time to develop their characters and tell a longer story, and they could build intrigue from week to week and episode to episode. James Gunn did say that the story will dictate whether something is a movie or a show, so I think this is a lesson that's probably already been learned. And so I think that's where I'm gonna end this video. If you could think of other things that I maybe missed, then let me know in the comments down below, but that's everything the DCU should try to avoid. Not all of these things are as important as, like, say, avoiding Zack Snyder at all costs, but I do think that the the DCU is in a rare position here of following up on so many other live-action DC properties, each one of which they could take a lesson from, as well as the MCU, and maybe because of that, that could potentially allow Gunn and the rest of the creatives behind the DCU to take those lessons and use them to make the best possible live-action DC universe. And all that out of the way, thanks so much for watching.